Marcus had been driving through the precinct for about 45 minutes when he saw the black and white patrol car pull out from a side street behind him. He checked his speedometer, exactly at the speed limit. His turn signals worked perfectly, and his nephew's Toyota had no broken lights. Still, he could see the patrol car following him closely in his rearview mirror. The red and blue lights flashed suddenly, and the patrol car's siren gave a short whoop. Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but he remained calm. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. He pulled over smoothly, positioning his car so that the hidden camera would have a clear view of both sides. Through his side mirror, Marcus watched two officers approach his car. Officer Sarah Mitchell walked up to his window, while Officer James Cooper stood slightly behind her, his hand resting casually on his holster. Marcus noticed that neither officer had activated their body cameras. "License and registration," Officer Mitchell said sharply, not even bothering with a greeting. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her face wore an expression of barely hidden disdain. Marcus kept his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for his wallet. "May I ask why I was stopped, officer?" he asked politely, using the educated tone that, according to the complaints, seemed to irritate these officers the most. Officer Mitchell's lip curled slightly. "You were swerving," she said, though both she and Marcus knew this wasn't true. "Had a few drinks today, sir." The way she said "sir" made it sound like an insult. "No, Officer Mitchell," Marcus replied, reading her nameplate. "I don't drink alcohol. I was driving perfectly straight, and I'd appreciate if you could check your dash cam footage to verify that." He handed over his license and registration with steady hands. Officer Cooper stepped forward then, his face showing amusement. Well, looks like we got ourselves an expert on police procedures here," he said, exchanging a knowing look with his partner. "You one of those YouTube lawyers?" Marcus remained silent as Officer Mitchell examined his documents. He noticed how she raised her eyebrows at his address. It was in an upscale neighborhood. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Mitchell ordered suddenly. "May I ask why that's necessary?" Marcus questioned calmly, making sure his hidden camera captured every word. "Because I said so," Mitchell snapped. "Or would you prefer to be charged with refusing to comply with a police officer's orders?" Cooper chuckled, moving his hand more deliberately over his weapon. "These types always think they know their rights," he said to Mitchell, loud enough for Marcus to hear, "until they end up face down on the pavement." Marcus felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same anger he felt reading all those complaints. But he kept his face neutral as he carefully opened his car door. The hidden camera would now be recording everything through the windshield. As he stepped out, Marcus noticed a second patrol car pulling up. Officer Mitchell was already calling dispatch, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet street. "Yeah, we got a situation here. Subject is being uncooperative." Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands visible at his sides. He was dressed in expensive but casual clothes, exactly the type of outfit that had triggered other stops according to the complaints. You could see Cooper's eyes taking in his designer watch and shoes. "Awful nice things for someone driving this kind of car," Cooper remarked with a smirk. "Care to explain that?" "I don't believe I'm required to explain my personal choices to you, Officer Cooper," Marcus replied evenly. "I would, however, like to know the actual reason for this stop, and why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle." Both officers laughed then, a harsh sound that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Two more officers were getting out of the second patrol car, and Marcus could see a third vehicle approaching in the distance. "Oh, you're one of those," Mitchell said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess, you're going to tell us you know someone important. That we're going to be sorry for this." Marcus remained silent, watching as the situation unfolded exactly as he had predicted. He hadn't expected to gather such clear evidence so quickly, but these officers were making it almost too easy. His DOJ badge felt heavy in his back pocket, but he wasn't ready to show it yet. He needed just a few more minutes of their true colors on camera. The evening air grew tense as four officers now surrounded Marcus. Officer Mitchell held his driver's license like it was something dirty, while Officer Cooper circled him slowly, trying to appear intimidating. The hidden camera in Marcus's car captured everything, including the way the officers kept exchanging amused glances with each other. "So, Mr. Thompson," Mitchell said, drawing out his name mockingly, "want to tell us what brings such a distinguished gentleman to this neighborhood. She emphasized the word distinguished with obvious sarcasm, making the other officers snicker. Marcus kept his voice steady and professional. I'm traveling through a public street in a properly registered vehicle. I don't believe I need to explain my presence to you. Cooper stopped his circling and stepped uncomfortably close to Marcus. You know what your problem is? You think you're better than us. Coming around here in your fancy clothes, talking like you swallowed a dictionary. He turned to his fellow officers. Bet he's got a trunk full of interesting things. What do you say we take a look? I do not consent to any searches, Marcus stated firmly, knowing his rights and making sure the camera picked up his clear refusal. There is no probable cause for a search, and I have committed no traffic violations. This brought out more laughter from the group. One of the newer officers, a young man with a buzz cut, spoke up. Did you hear that? I do not consent. Man, I love it when they try to sound all educated. He pitched his voice higher, making a mocking imitation. I do not consent. Sounds like one of those civil rights lawyers. Mitchell stepped closer, her face hardening. Listen here, Mr. Fancy Words. This is our precinct. We don't need probable cause. We need you to cooperate, or things are going to get very difficult for you very quickly. Marcus noticed how she kept her body angled away from his car's hidden camera. They thought they were being careful, but they had no idea they were documenting their own misconduct. You could see another patrol car pulling up, bringing the total to 4 police vehicles for one simple traffic stop. Officer Mitchell, Marcus said calmly, I'd like to speak with your supervisor. And I notice none of your body cameras are activated. Could you please explain why? Cooper's face darkened. Oh, you're one of those types who's going to file a complaint, aren't you? He stepped even closer, his breath hitting Marcus's face. Go ahead. File your complaint. See where that gets you. Nobody's going to believe you over 6 police officers. The other officers moved in closer, creating a tight circle around Marcus. He could feel their intimidation tactics, the way they were trying to make him nervous and afraid. In his 15 years as a DOJ investigator, he had seen this pattern many times, but experiencing it firsthand was different. Last chance, Mitchell said, her hand now resting on her handcuffs. Either we search your car right now, or you go to jail for interfering with a police investigation. Your choice, Mr. Thompson. Marcus stood his ground, keeping his hands visible but not submissive. Officers, I want to be clear. I am not consenting to any searches, and I am requesting a supervisor. If you continue this illegal detention, there will be consequences. This brought out the loudest laugh yet from the group. Mitchell actually had to wipe her eyes. She was laughing so hard. Consequences. Did you hear that, Cooper? He's threatening us with consequences. Man, I love it when they talk tough, Cooper replied, grinning widely. Especially when they're about 10 seconds away from taking a ride downtown in handcuffs. Marcus could see the situation was about to escalate further. The officers were so caught up in their power trip that they had completely dropped any pretense of professional behavior. Their badges glinted in the evening light as they moved even closer, probably expecting him to show fear or break down. Instead, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The hidden camera had captured more than enough evidence. It was time to end this charade, but first, he wanted to give them one last chance to step back from the edge they were so eagerly approaching. The street lights had begun to flicker on as the evening grew darker. 6 officers now surrounded Marcus, their patrol cars' flashing lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. Curious onlookers had started gathering on the sidewalk, some holding up their phones to record the scene. Marcus noticed Officer Mitchell glancing nervously at the growing crowd. All right, that's enough playing around, Cooper announced, pulling his handcuffs from his belt. Mr. Thompson here clearly needs to learn some respect for law enforcement. He moved behind Marcus, roughly grabbing his arm. Hands behind your back. Marcus kept his arms at his sides, standing straight and dignified. Officer Cooper, this is your final warning. What you're doing is illegal, and you're making a serious mistake. The warning only made the officers laugh harder. Mitchell stepped forward, her face twisted with contempt. A warning? From you? She turned to the gathering crowd. Everyone clear the area. This is police business. But the onlookers didn't move. More phones came out, recording the scene. Marcus could hear whispered conversations. They're doing it again. Poor man, somebody needs to call somebody about these cops. Cooper tightened his grip on Marcus's arm. I said, hands behind your back. Do not resist arrest. What exactly am I being arrested for? Marcus asked loudly, making sure both his hidden camera and the bystanders' phones could pick up his words. I've broken no laws. You haven't even told me why you pulled me over. A young female officer who had arrived in the last patrol car stepped forward. He's got a point, she said quietly to Mitchell. We don't really have. Shut up, Rodriguez, Mitchell snapped. He's resisting arrest and interfering with a police investigation. That's enough. She moved closer to Marcus, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. You think you're so smart with your fancy talk and expensive clothes. Let's see how smart you look spending the night in lockup. Marcus noticed Rodriguez step back, looking uncomfortable. At least one officer still had a conscience. He made a mental note of her name and badge number for later. Cooper started to force Marcus's arms behind his back. You have the right to remain silent. I don't think that will be necessary, Officer Cooper, Marcus said calmly, though his heart was racing. The situation had escalated exactly as he had predicted, but it was still unsettling to experience such blatant abuse of power firsthand. Oh, you don't think it's necessary? Cooper laughed, pushing Marcus against the car. And why's that? Your daddy a lawyer or something? The other officers joined in the laughter, except for Rodriguez, who was now studying her shoes intently. Mitchell stepped closer, her face inches from Marcus's. Go ahead, tell us why we should let you go. I could use another good laugh. Marcus took a deep breath. He could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs touching his wrist. In his pocket, his real ID burned like a hot coal, waiting to be revealed. But he wanted to give them one last chance to step back from the precipice they were racing toward. Officers, he said clearly, making sure every word was captured by all recording devices present. I am giving you one final opportunity to cease this illegal detention and harassment. What you are doing is a clear violation of multiple federal laws and constitutional rights. The burst of laughter that followed was the loudest yet. Cooper actually had to lean against the car to steady himself. Did you hear that? He wheezed. Federal laws. Constitutional rights. Mitchell wiped tears from her eyes. Oh, this is too good. Please tell me you're not done. What other big words do you know? The crowd had grown larger, and Marcus could hear angry muttering from the onlookers. Some were shouting at the officers to stop, while others were calling for help on their phones. The situation was about to boil over. Marcus straightened his shoulders, decision made. It was time to end this farce. His hand moved slowly toward his back pocket, where his DOJ credentials waited. The street lights had begun to flicker on as the evening grew darker. 6 officers now surrounded Marcus, their patrol cars' flashing lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. Curious onlookers had started gathering on the sidewalk, some holding up their phones to record the scene. Marcus noticed Officer Mitchell glancing nervously at the growing crowd. All right, that's enough playing around, Cooper announced, pulling his handcuffs from his belt. Mr. Thompson here clearly needs to learn some respect for law enforcement. He moved behind Marcus, roughly grabbing his arm. Hands behind your back. Marcus kept his arms at his sides, standing straight and dignified. Officer Cooper, this is your final warning. What you're doing is illegal, and you're making a serious mistake. The warning only made the officers laugh harder. Mitchell stepped forward, her face twisted with contempt. A warning? From you? She turned to the gathering crowd. Everyone clear the area. This is police business. But the onlookers didn't move. More phones came out, recording the scene. Marcus could hear whispered conversations. They're doing it again. Poor man. Somebody needs to call somebody about these cops. Cooper tightened his grip on Marcus's arm. I said, hands behind your back. Do not resist arrest. What exactly am I being arrested for? Marcus asked loudly, making sure both his hidden camera and the bystanders' phones could pick up his words. I've broken no laws. You haven't even told me why you pulled me over. A young female officer, who had arrived in the last patrol car, stepped forward. He's got a point, she said quietly to Mitchell. We don't really have. Shut up, Rodriguez, Mitchell snapped. He's resisting arrest and interfering with a police investigation. That's enough. She moved closer to Marcus, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. You think you're so smart with your fancy talk and expensive clothes. Let's see how smart you look spending the night in lockup. Marcus noticed Rodriguez step back, looking uncomfortable. At least one officer still had a conscience. He made a mental note of her name and badge number for later. Cooper started to force Marcus's arms behind his back. You have the right to remain silent. I don't think that will be necessary, Officer Cooper, Marcus said calmly, though his heart was racing. The situation had escalated exactly as he had predicted, but it was still unsettling to experience such blatant abuse of power firsthand. Oh, you don't think it's necessary? Cooper laughed, pushing Marcus against the car. And why's that? Your daddy a lawyer or something? The other officers joined in the laughter, except for Rodriguez, who was now studying her shoes intently. Mitchell stepped closer, her face inches from Marcus's. Go ahead, tell us why we should let you go. I could use another good laugh. Marcus took a deep breath. He could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs touching his wrist. In his pocket, his real ID burned like a hot coal, waiting to be revealed. But he wanted to give them one last chance to step back from the precipice they were racing toward. Officers, he said clearly, making sure every word was captured by all recording devices present, I am giving you one final opportunity to cease this illegal detention and harassment. What you are doing is a clear violation of multiple federal laws and constitutional rights. The burst of laughter that followed was the loudest yet. Cooper actually had to lean against the car to steady himself. Did you hear that? He wheezed. Federal laws, constitutional rights. Mitchell wiped tears from her eyes. Oh, this is too good. Please tell me you're not done. What other big words do you know? The crowd had grown larger, and Marcus could hear angry muttering from the onlookers. Some were shouting at the officers to stop, while others were calling for help on their phones. The situation was about to boil over. Marcus straightened his shoulders, decision made. It was time to end this farce. His hand moved slowly toward his back pocket, where his DOJ credentials waited. Time seemed to slow down as Marcus reached for his back pocket. Officer Cooper immediately drew his weapon halfway out of its holster. Hands where I can see them, he shouted, his previous laughter instantly replaced by aggressive authority. I'm reaching for my identification, Marcus said calmly, his movements deliberately slow and clear. I suggest everyone pay very close attention to what I'm about to show you. Mitchell rolled her eyes. We'd already seen your driver's license, Mr. Big Shot. What else could you possibly? Her words cut off abruptly as Marcus pulled out a black leather wallet, different from the one that had held his driver's license. The crowd grew quiet. Even the night air seemed to still as he flipped it open, revealing a golden badge that gleamed under the streetlights. I am Supervisory Special Agent Marcus Thompson of the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. And this entire incident has been recorded as part of an ongoing federal investigation into discriminatory practices in this precinct. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Cooper's face drained of all color, his hand dropping away from his weapon. Mitchell stumbled backward as if she'd been struck, her mouth opening and closing without making a sound. The other officers scattered like startled birds, creating distance between themselves and what had just become a career-ending situation. Only Officer Rodriguez remained where she was, a look of grim satisfaction crossing her face. Marcus made another mental note. She might prove useful in the broader investigation. We didn't. Mitchell's voice had lost all its previous arrogance, replaced by trembling fear. This was a routine traffic stop, sir. We were just. Officer Mitchell, Marcus cut her off sharply. In the past 20 minutes, you and your fellow officers have violated multiple federal laws and constitutional protections. Everything from the initial stop to your threats of false arrest have been captured on video. My hidden camera has been recording this entire encounter, and, he gestured to the crowd of onlookers, it seems we have plenty of civilian witnesses as well. Cooper had backed up against his patrol car, looking like he might be sick. Sir, please. My pension. My family. You should have thought about your family before you decided to abuse your authority, Marcus replied firmly. He reached into his car and pressed a button on his dashboard, sending a prearranged signal. Within seconds, 3 unmarked federal vehicles turned onto the street, their lights flashing. The gathering crowd had begun to cheer and clap. Someone shouted, "Finally! Someone's doing something about these corrupt cops." Several people were still recording, their phones capturing every moment of the officer's humiliation. Special Agent Lisa Chen, who had been watching the entire scene from an unmarked car down the street, stepped out with other DOJ agents. She approached the group, her badge displayed prominently. "Officers Mitchell and Cooper will need your badges and weapons. You're both being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full federal investigation." Marcus watched as the 2 officers who had been laughing at him just minutes ago numbly handed over their equipment. Mitchell's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped her badge. Cooper looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 5 minutes. "The 47th Precinct has been under federal surveillance for the past 6 months," Marcus announced, addressing all the officers present. "We have documented dozens of similar incidents of racial profiling and civil rights violations. This stops today." He turned to Officer Rodriguez, who stood straighter under his gaze. "Officer, I noticed your discomfort with your colleagues' actions. We'll be in touch. The DOJ is very interested in officers who maintain their integrity even under peer pressure." The street had become a flurry of activity. Federal agents were collecting witness statements from the crowd. More senior police officials were arriving, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. And in the middle of it all, Marcus stood tall, his badge still gleaming in the evening light. A symbol of justice finally being served. The next 2 hours transformed the quiet street into a hub of intense activity. Police cars and federal vehicles lined both sides of the road, their emergency lights creating a dance of red and blue against the buildings. Captain Richard Hayes, commander of the 47th Precinct, arrived looking like he had just been woken from a deep sleep, which in fact he had been. Marcus sat in the back of an unmarked federal vehicle, watching as Agent Chen coordinated the initial investigation. She had set up a temporary command center in a mobile unit, where technicians were already downloading footage from his hidden camera. On the street, other agents were taking statements from witnesses who had recorded the incident on their phones. Officers Mitchell and Cooper sat in separate police cars, both looking shell-shocked. Mitchell's carefully maintained appearance had crumbled, her tight bun now messy, her face pale and drawn. Cooper hadn't moved or spoken since surrendering his badge, just staring straight ahead with empty eyes. Agent Thompson, a young officer, approached the car. Rodriguez, the one who had shown doubt during the incident. Her face was tense but determined. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus nodded and stepped out of the vehicle. "What's on your mind, Officer Rodriguez?" She glanced around nervously before speaking. "What happened tonight? It wasn't just Mitchell and Cooper. There's more. A lot more." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I've been keeping records. Dates, times, names. I wanted to report it, but..." She trailed off, looking at her feet. "But you were afraid of retaliation," Marcus finished for her. When she nodded, he continued, "We'll need your testimony, Officer Rodriguez. Are you willing to make an official statement?" "Yes, sir," she replied without hesitation. "I became a cop to help people, not this." She pulled out a small notebook from her uniform pocket. "Everything's in here. 3 months of incidents." Meanwhile, Captain Hayes was having a very different conversation with Agent Chen. His face had turned from sleepy to thunderous as she showed him preliminary evidence on her tablet, not just from tonight's incident, but from dozens of other documented cases. "This is impossible," Hayes sputtered, his face growing redder by the minute. "I would have known if my officers were." "You did know," Marcus interrupted, walking over to join them. The complaint patterns were clear. The timing of incidents, the specific officers involved, the types of citizens targeted, it all pointed to systematic discrimination. You just chose not to see it. Hayes's face went from red to purple. "Now listen here." "No, you listen," Marcus cut him off firmly. "Your precinct is now under federal oversight. Every complaint, every traffic stop, every arrest will be reviewed. We're setting up an office in your building starting tomorrow morning." The captain's bluster deflated like a punctured balloon. He looked around at the scene. Federal agents everywhere, his officers giving statements. News vans starting to arrive at the edges of the police barrier. His career was effectively over, and he knew it. Back on the street, a small group of local residents had gathered behind the police tape. Among them was James Turner, the college student whose complaint had first caught Marcus's attention. The young man's eyes were wide as he watched Mitchell and Cooper being processed. "Mr. Turner," Marcus called out, walking over to him, "would you be willing to come down to our office tomorrow? Your complaint helped start this investigation. We'd like to include your full testimony in the federal case." Turner nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "They didn't think anybody would believe us," he said softly. "They thought they were untouchable." Marcus placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Nobody's untouchable. Sometimes justice takes time, but it comes eventually." He looked back at the scene behind him, where Agent Chen was now sealing evidence bags containing Mitchell's and Cooper's badges. It always comes. The night air had grown cooler, but nobody seemed to notice. There was too much work to be done, too many statements to take, too much evidence to process. This was just the beginning of what would become one of the most significant police reform cases in the city's history. The following weeks at the 47th Precinct were unlike anything its officers had ever experienced. The Department of Justice had taken over the precinct's conference room, turning it into a temporary federal office. Files covered every surface, and investigators worked around the clock, uncovering years of misconduct. Marcus sat at what had once been Captain Hayes's desk, reviewing Officer Rodriguez's notebook. The small book contained detailed records of over 50 incidents of racial profiling and harassment. Each entry included dates, times, officer names, and victim information. It was a gold mine of evidence. "You need to see this," Agent Chen said, walking in with a stack of papers. She dropped them on the desk with a heavy thud. "We found deleted body camera footage from the past year. The IT department thought they had erased it completely, but our tech team recovered everything." Marcus picked up the first report. "How bad?" "Worse than we thought," Chen replied, pulling up a chair. Mitchell and Cooper weren't just targeting black professionals. They were shaking down small business owners in the community, threatening them with false charges unless they paid protection money. The investigation had grown far beyond the original civil rights violations. What had started as a case of racial profiling had unveiled a complex web of corruption that spread through multiple levels of the precinct's command structure. Officer Rodriguez had become a key witness, working closely with the federal team. Her testimony, combined with her detailed records, had already led to the suspension of 12 more officers. She now sat in a corner of the conference room, helping investigators match her notes with recovered body camera footage. "Agent Thompson," a young investigator knocked on the office door. "We just finished interviewing Mr. Turner and the other victims. Their stories match perfectly with Officer Rodriguez's notes and the recovered footage. But there's something else." Marcus looked up from his files. "What is it?" "Some of the victims mentioned other precincts. Similar patterns, same tactics. This might be bigger than just the 47th. Marcus exchanged looks with Agent Chen. They had suspected this might be the case, but now they had concrete evidence. The investigation would need to expand. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, the changes were already visible. New officers had been brought in from other districts to replace the suspended ones. Every patrol car had been equipped with tamper-proof cameras that couldn't be turned off. Body cameras were now mandatory and automatically uploaded footage to a secure federal server. The local community had noticed the changes too. People who had once avoided the precinct now came forward with their stories. The conference room had a constant stream of visitors. Business owners, students, professionals, all sharing similar experiences of harassment and discrimination. Marcus was reviewing a particularly disturbing piece of footage when his phone rang. It was Director Roberts from the DOJ headquarters. "Thompson, I just got out of a meeting with the Attorney General," Roberts said without preamble. "They want to use the 47th Precinct case as a template for a nationwide investigation. Your operation exposed something much bigger than we anticipated." Marcus thought about Officer Mitchell's smirk when she had pulled him over, about Cooper's threatening stance, about all the people who had suffered similar treatment but hadn't had a DOJ badge to protect them. "Send me whatever you need," he replied. "This has to stop, not just here, but everywhere." After hanging up, Marcus walked to the window overlooking the precinct's parking lot. New patrol cars were lined up, their fresh community-first decals gleaming in the sunlight. Officer Rodriguez was outside, talking with a group of rookie officers who had just been assigned to the precinct. The investigation had revealed ugly truths, but it had also shown that change was possible. For every corrupt officer like Mitchell and Cooper, there was someone like Rodriguez, people who wanted to serve and protect, who just needed the support and security to do what was right. A small crowd had gathered across the street, watching the precinct. But this time, instead of fear and distrust in their eyes, there was something new: hope. 6 months after the night of Marcus Thompson's traffic stop, the 47th precinct looked like a completely different place. The building's entrance now featured a large community bulletin board, filled with photos of officers participating in neighborhood events. Inside, the walls displayed new signs in multiple languages explaining citizens' rights and how to file complaints. Marcus stood in the precinct's newly renovated training room, watching as Officer Rodriguez led a session on cultural sensitivity and civil rights. She had been promoted to training officer, responsible for teaching new recruits how to serve their community with respect and dignity. And remember, Rodriguez said to the attentive group of officers, what happened with Officers Mitchell and Cooper is an ancient history. It happened right here, in this building, just 6 months ago. Their story is now part of our mandatory training. On the screen behind her played the video from Marcus's hidden camera that fateful night. The room was silent as the new officers watched their former colleagues destroy their careers through bigotry and abuse of power. Down the hall, in what had once been the DOJ's temporary office, the new Internal Affairs Unit was hard at work. The unit was now staffed by a mixed team of local and federal officers, ensuring that complaints were investigated properly. Marcus checked his watch. It was almost time for the press conference. Outside, news vans were already setting up their equipment. Today would mark the official end of the federal oversight period, though the changes it had brought would remain permanent. In the precinct's parking lot, James Turner, the college student whose complaint had helped start it all, was giving a tour to a group of high school students. He had been hired as the precinct's community liaison officer, building bridges between the police and the neighborhood they served. Agent Thompson, a voice called from behind him. Marcus turned to see Captain Sarah Chen, his former DOJ colleague who had been appointed as the precinct's new commander after Hayes' resignation. They're ready for us. They walked together to the press conference area, where reporters and community members had gathered. The Attorney General herself had flown in for this announcement, standing at the podium with a thick report in her hands. 6 months ago, the Attorney General began, this precinct was a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement. Today, it stands as a model for police reform across the nation. The changes implemented here have been so successful that we're rolling out similar programs in 20 other cities. Marcus scanned the crowd as she spoke. He saw many familiar faces. Community members who had come forward with their stories, officers who had chosen integrity over silence, business owners who had suffered under the old regime. Their presence today showed how far things had come. The Attorney General continued. Former officers Mitchell and Cooper have pleaded guilty to multiple civil rights violations and corruption charges. They will serve significant prison terms. More importantly, the system that allowed their behavior to flourish has been dismantled and rebuilt. Near the back of the crowd, Marcus spotted Officer Rodriguez talking with a group of young black professionals, the same type of people who had once been targeted for harassment. Now they were part of the precinct's community advisory board, helping shape police policies and practices. After the press conference, Marcus walked through the precinct one last time. His work here was done, and a new assignment awaited him in another city. But this precinct would always hold a special place in his heart. It had proved that real change was possible. As he reached his car, James Turner ran up to him. Agent Thompson, I just wanted to say thank you, not just for what you did that night, but for showing us that the system can work when good people stand up. Marcus smiled and shook Turner's hand. The real heroes are people like you and Officer Rodriguez, people who refuse to accept injustice as normal. Keep holding everyone accountable, including me and my fellow federal agents. Driving away from the 47th precinct, Marcus passed a patrol car making its rounds. The officers inside waved to pedestrians, and people waved back without fear. On the side of the car, below the precinct number, was the new motto that the community had chosen: protecting rights, serving all. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. It was a new day for the 47th precinct, and hopefully soon for many others like it across the country.